Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and as always, it's my privilege to be with you. We're beginning a new lesson series of lessons for the month of August today. And as we look at this unit, we want to consider the topic for this unit, which is the pursuit of the people. I want to read to you what the lesson writers you do say to describe this unit. They say it takes a closer look at the promises as well as challenges in living non-violently today. Our lessons explore how others will know we're Christians, not only by our love, but also by the peace we embody in a violent world. Certainly, we are only too aware of how violent our world is. It's always been violent. It's always been the human tendency to strike back first rather than to regain our composure and try to work through things. One of the things that I was taught as a counselor is trying to help people see the difference between a reaction to something that happened versus taking action in response to something that happened. A reaction is usually without much thought. If there's any thought process that takes place, it's how to respond appropriately to that, uh, whatever it was, and uh, how to get the other person to stop or get the situation to end. Instead, with action, what we do is we can take that emotional step back and look at things and say, okay, this situation is not good. What can I do that can change this situation effectively? And when we do that, we often see that striking back in a violent kind of way, or in a verbal kind of way, or an emotional kind of way, is not the best way to work that through. Instead, those kind of reactions just prompt a similar reaction, and so the process just continues to escalate. And that's not good. And that's not how God wants us to live our lives. He wants us to be people of peace, and He wants us to have peace. That's why that word shalom is so important to the Jewish people. God has always been a God of shalom, peace. What we find here in this lesson for today is we're looking at First Chronicles. And this is a book that goes all the way back to King David and to his days, during the time when the people had come out of exile and they were battling with the people who were living in Canaan and in that area, and they were winning the land and uh, gaining control of the land, and it was a very warlike situation. And many times they were the invaders; they were the ones who were instigating these things. Sometimes the other peoples that were already there, rather than uh, again taking action, taking that step back and saying, there's plenty of land, there's plenty of opportunity here, come in and join with us. They um, got their armies together and met them on the battlefield and said, right makes right. And in our world today, we live a lot by that might makes right kind of mentality. We see that happening in interpersonal relationships as well as international relationships. And that's not pleasing to God. And that's a part of what this story that we're going to look at today, as we look at David and Solomon, brings out to us how God understands that our world is a violent world and that sometimes we're left with no recourse. But before we get to that point of no recourse, there are several steps that we, as His people, are called upon to consider and to try to work through, to try to be instruments of peace and keeping things in harmony. And certainly, it's so much easier to rebuild from a conflict where you haven't gotten physical and hurt each other or left lasting kind of marks or stains on the relationship than it is afterwards, after you've had this knockdown, drag out kind of a fight kind of a thing. Whether it's a nation against nation or person against person. So we're here in Chronicles, and we're looking at the story of the transition between David and his son Solomon. Pardon me for a second. Here we're seeing that David has finished his leadership role as a military leader of the Jewish people. Things are settling down. He's been able to build himself a palace. And that's a part of what he says in chapter 17. Now, that's not part of our focal passage for today, but it's some background passage for us. In chapter 17, David becomes aware that, hey, things are beginning to settle down a little bit right now. Maybe I need to consider some other things other than just war and preparing for war and that kind of thing. Listen to what it says in chapter 17, verse 1. It says, after David was settled in his palace, he said to Nathan the prophet, here I am living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent. David had good intentions and good insights, and he was a man of God. And he had this sense of, okay, God has taken care of me, and we have won the battles, and we have established peace, as much of a peace as we can have as human beings with one another. And that's been settled, and we now have a clear pecking order. We know who's in charge and who can say yes and no and that sort of thing. All that's settled. And now it's time for us to really stop for a moment and consider those quality components of our relationship with God. That's the way we are as churches sometimes, isn't it? We get caught up in other things. Maybe it's a building project. Maybe it's a ministry that we're doing in another community or something like that. And we get distracted a little bit. We get focused on those kinds of things, and that's not a bad thing. And yet, following that, there's that coming back and that regrouping and saying, okay, now let's resume our ministry here. Let's go back to what we were doing that was working. Let's be God's people in this place and in this time. Well, David had gotten to that point. He says, it's no longer necessary for us to be such warriors. It's the time for us to enjoy the peace that God has blessed us with. Excuse me. And so here we see in Chronicles, the chronicler is writing out this story. Now, one of the things I need to say to you about Chronicles, this is a book that was written very much later than the events that it's writing about. You know, the chronicler was probably writing his book at around the year 350 BC, which is certainly several hundred years after David and Solomon lived. And so he had the advantage of looking back and also interpreting some of the things that happened and how they happened in the light of things that had happened in between the two times. So we see in Chronicles a little bit of a softening of this account. If you look in Kings and you look in Samuel, and you see similar accounts of this, you might see a little more war, a little more violent kind of context to these sorts of stories. But here in Chronicles, you see the chronicle who's able to back off a little bit, they're backing off again, and see the whole story and see how God reacted in that situation and how, based on how they've seen God react since then, how they see God and understand God based on all those things together. So Chronicles represents a little bit more mature, a little bit more insightful view of the situation. And so the chronicler says, David, even though he felt this need to begin focusing on God, focusing on building the temple, he represented a transition point. You know, in the Bible, there are many transition points. As in the prophets, there's Elijah, who passes the mantle of prophecy on to Elisha. There's Moses, who passes the mantle of leadership on to Joshua. Here in this passage today, we have David, who's passing the mantle of kingship onto his son Solomon. And it's those transitional times that we see God moving in the hearts and lives of people in a special way. A change of emphasis, a change of focus, a change of how God is calling his people to act and react. And in this situation, God is saying it's time for peace. It's a time to focus on the good things, to be able to not just focus on survival, not just focus on keeping yourself and your family safe, but to focus on quality components, like who is God and what is he wanting us to do in the sense of living our lives as he created us to do that. And so that quality of life is coming back. And God is saying, I wish for you these things. And even though David says, Father, I want to build this temple, God says, no, David, you're not the right person to do this. Because you have been so involved in the traumatic part of settling the land and coming to this peace. There's still so much of that trauma that's associated with you that people are going to see force and assertiveness and demand when they see you and things related to you. What God desired is that the people might see a king who was a king of peace, who represented peace, who served in a time of peace, and who, based on that peace, could call people in to a personal relationship with God, into this beautiful kingdom. Now, David accepted his role, and he even went further in taking up the mantle now, not building the temple, but making sure that things were beginning to get in place. Perhaps he commissioned stonemasons to start building the stones for the walls and for the temple, starting drawing up plans, and getting wood and other things that would need to be used for the temple. All of those things. He started amassing those things and using his authority and his empowerment as king to prepare the way. And then here in chapter 17 is where we see David turning the reins over to Solomon. Listen to what he says here. We're going to read verse 6 to verse 10. David sent for his son Solomon and instructed him to build a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, my son, I had intended to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, but the Lord told me, you've shed too much blood and waged great wars. You won't build a temple for my name because you spilled so much blood on the ground before me. Sounds a little bit like Cain and Abel, where the blood of his brothers spoke out to God. There's something about that spilling of blood. Blood representing the life force within people. A son has just been born to you. This is what God said to David. A son has just been born to you. He'll be a man of peace, and I'll give him peace with all his surrounding enemies. In fact, his name will be Solomon, and I will give Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He will be the one to build a temple for my name. He will become my son, and I'll become his father, and I'll establish his royal throne over Israel forever. God has made this promise to David, remember, prior to this, that his kingdom, his throne, his family, his influence would continue on in the life of the people of Israel forever. And here he's saying, your son Solomon's going to take that mantle and move forward under my empowerment and my help. God's response to David is not chastising him. He's saying, David, you've got to understand, you were the right person at the right time and able to do the job in the way that no one else did. And I was able to empower you and to do those things, to be the leader that people needed. And yet you need to understand now is a time of transition. And because of all that has happened, you're not the right person to follow. That reminds us, doesn't it, just how important it is as parents, as role models in our churches, as neighbors and friends, and aunts and uncles, and all those relationships that we have. How ministry is so important a part of living the Christian life, mentoring others, preparing them, teaching them the things that we've learned so that they don't have to learn those lessons necessarily for themselves. Sometimes people refuse to hear and have to learn for themselves. Sometimes they're able to be wise and hear that response and respond to it. And that's what God desires from us, to be people that pass on the truth of His love and grace. And he said Solomon is a person who can make this transition between a warring nation and a nation of peace. The chronicler is looking back on this and seeing how indeed that took place. It didn't stay peaceful because people's relationship with God didn't stay consistent and forthwith and all that sort of thing. God had to adjust His plan in relationship to our people's expression of the free will and those types of things. And so the story goes on. And yet the chronicler is able to go back and affirm that this is the beginning of something wonderful. God established the temple as the place of reference for our worship, and how we were so refocused, not just as warring people, on worshiping God. It says, then David ordered all of Israel's leaders to help his son Solomon. The Lord your God is with you. He will give you peace on every side. He's placed under my power the land's people. Placed under my power the land's people, so that the land is under the control of the Lord and His people. Now then, dedicate yourselves to seeking the Lord your God. Go to work and build the sanctuary for the Lord God, so that the chest containing the Lord's covenant, together with God's holy equipment, may be brought into the temple built for the Lord's name. David is talking to these leaders, and like a great leader, preparing his troops for battle, so to speak, he gives them this speech, like Coach Saban getting ready for the team to run out on the field and talk about the team they're facing and the situation they're in, and how they need to focus on one another, support one another, build on each other's strengths, all those kinds of things. David is doing that here for the leaders who will need to be loyal and faithful in following his son Solomon. David challenges the leaders to support Solomon. He says, don't feel so close to me that you have to feel like Solomon is somehow taking something away from you. No, I'm passing this mantle willingly on to Solomon. And I want you to give him the same support that you give me. The king framed this work within the context of a new age. He says, it's a new time. It's not my time anymore. My time is coming to an end. And this is a new age. We need to enter it with a sense of expectation and hope. So to build a sanctuary to help the community worship God. Making it clear the purpose is we are building a temple, and we're doing it so that we can refocus our attention in a very special and powerful way on God Himself. And the leaders themselves need to focus on seeking God as their Lord. They're investing in Yahweh's plan for peace. This unit is about peace. It's about being God's people of peace. It's about understanding that peace is God's first choice. That's the title of today's lesson, God's first choice. And peace is what God desires. He wants us to be people who act, not just live. He wants us to be people of love, but a love that's consistent and sincere, and it's based on trying to seek the best resolution whenever possible. A powerful lesson today if you look at David and Saul. Transition of power, beginning of a new age, new. In our world, it seems like the only thing that's consistent is change. And so it was in the days of David and Saul. Change. We have a hard time with change. David knew that about his leaders and his people. They're going to have a hard time settling down. They're going to have a hard time uh, turning their swords into plows and their spears into pruning hooks. And yet God says, this is my will. It's time to put those things, those tools aside and pick up new tools so that you can be my people in this world. This week, I hope that you can encounter this idea of being God's person, where you are, who you are, in your relationship